Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing something very exciting, and that is talking all things annotation. You guys know I love to annotate my books. I've talked about this before. Not all of them, but I would say at least 50 to 60% or so. And I've talked about annotating in my how I got back into reading video. I have a lot of tips there for people like myself who have ADD. And because of that, oftentimes the minute that I close a book, I completely forget what I just read. My brain just has such a hard time committing things to memory. So a little over a year ago, I started annotating my books as mostly just a way to commit more of my books to memory and be able to remember more of a book's content. But it also helps me to be more engaged in the reading process overall. It is literally a way to trick my brain into having more fun. It becomes more of an activity rather than just a passive hobby. And it's fun, it's almost like I personally love to write in my books. So sometimes I truly am just writing as if it's a journal. I find that annotating is a great way to track my reactions to the things that I'm reading. It has helped me notice a lot of patterns and highlight themes. I don't really have a rigid system. I just kind of let it flow, and it has slowly sort of evolved over time with more and more practice. And I saw Elizabeth from Plant-Based Bride recently do a video on this where she showed every page of her annotated copy of North and South, and I was like, oh my gosh, I want to do that because I recently read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and as you can see, this thing is heavily annotated, okay? I loved this book. If you guys watched my Pals reading vlog that just recently came out, that is where I talk about my kind of more in-depth, non-spoiler thoughts on this book, and today we are talking spoilers and annotation. So I was inspired by her video to do something similar where I kind of talk to you guys a little bit about how I annotate and also do a full flip through of this book so you can see page by page kind of where my thought process was and what things I was kind of looking out for. So yes, we will get into this, but very, very quickly, I just wanted to do a breakdown of kind of my process, the supplies that I use, and then, we'll get into the actual flip through because I know that's why you guys are all here. So the first step for me is deciding whether or not a book I am going to read is even one that I want to annotate. When I first started out about a year ago, I tended to only annotate certain genres because that's kind of where I felt most comfortable. For instance, I almost always annotated literary fiction and still do. It's my favorite genre, so for me it is the most comfortable. So I tend to get a lot out of it and feel that there is a lot there to unpack for me personally. I would also annotate sci-fi, nonfiction, but over the last year, I again have kind of developed my flow and I have wanted to branch out and challenge myself. I realized that I should not just annotate the genres that I am most comfortable annotating or reading, because a large part of annotation is strengthening that ability to read more critically. So I found that I wasn't really challenging myself to read more critically because I was pretty familiar with the kind of general themes and formats and structures of a genre that I read all the time. So I wanted to challenge myself and you by proxy to unlock deeper meaning from any book that could be on your shelf. In this case, I knew that Piranesi involves some sort of a labyrinth situation. It seemed to me kind of like a mystery, so I knew that I definitely wanted to annotate it. I wanted to potentially track themes and clues and character development, so that's where I started with this guy. Once I decide to annotate a book, I typically will pick up a set of tabs. I have many different colored versions of these tabs. I often like to match them to the cover of my book because it is more aesthetically pleasing to do so, and thus I do it. I mean, come on, it's just beautiful when they match. I also have a cream colored, this is a Tombow pen, but basically a highlighter. I like it to be cream so that it kind of matches the color of the page. I don't really like to highlight in crazy colors, so this is what I use. And then I also have a 0.3 or 0.4 millimeter pen for writing in my books. I pretty much write in all my books that I annotate. I had sticky notes in the beginning, but I really just feel like it is a step removed from the process for me personally, so I just straight up write in my books unless I really don't know if I'm gonna want to sell it after I finish reading it, because I don't know if I'll like it. So this is a Pentel Arts Hybrid Technica. This is a really good gel pen. And then once all my supplies are gathered, I start reading. And at this point, there are kind of two ways that I will annotate. The first and sort of most basic way is that I will just read through the book and only tab things that are standing out to me or that I'm tracking. I typically don't highlight or write in the book at all. I am just putting adding tabs in. And I do this for kind of two reasons. One could be if I'm really unsure if I will connect with the book overall or the content of the book, and thus like might want to end up just selling it back to half price books after I'm done with it and don't want to ruin the pages, but still kind of want to be able to keep track of things that I could refer back to. And the other reason is simply just because I want to be able to mark moments for recall without necessarily feeling the need to do a deeper analysis. A great example of this is I just read the Divine Rivals duology. I could just kind of tell from pretty early on in the book that the content was a little bit less thematically dense, and it was more just kind of about the story of these two characters, you know, falling in love. So for me, I was like, okay, well, there are things that I want to track as far as like the world building, the myths, the gods, and the romance between them, so that I could refer back to it after I finished the book and kind of help myself remember. But there was not necessarily anything deeper happening there that I felt the need to like really thoroughly kind of get into. So I just tabbed those books and I did not do any sort of marking up. And after I finish, I will often like flip back through to the points that I've tabbed. And when I'm writing my reflection in my reading journal, I kind of again have that second point of contact with the text to be able to commit more of it to memory as I'm writing my reflection. But when I want to go deeper, like with Piranesi and a lot of the books that I do read, I will highlight, I'll underline, I will write in the book, I will do it all. And one thing I'll say straight away is with both methods, don't be afraid to change your mind, especially if you're like me. You guys know I do not like to read anything about a book before I go into it. I really like to go in pretty blind. For that reason, I often am kind of figuring out what the heck is going on in the first 50 to 100 pages. So I may assign a color tab in my key to something that I noticed like once or twice in the beginning and then never comes up again. So don't be afraid to change them around. For me, like I said, I have a Sharpie and I just write on the actual tab itself in the beginning of the book what it is that color is tracking, and sometimes they change and that's totally fine. So when it comes to the actual tabs in the key, what exactly is it that I'm annotating? Well, there's some things that I tend to track across pretty much every book that I read, and the biggest one for me is themes or thematic content that is being explored. So I will typically just put one tab for themes, and that's kind of like an all-encompassing umbrella of any number of themes that might be being explored. I will just tab them all with the same color. But there are a few cases where I have actually delved even deeper, like for example with Department of Speculation by Jenny Offill, which I read earlier this year. I actually had 2 or 3 different themes that I tracked with 3 different colors because I wanted to annotate those specific themes even more thoroughly than just kind of a general broad spectrum of themes. I wanted to be able to see exactly where one specific theme was coming up repetitiously and so on. So that is a very rare example, but it does happen sometimes. Something else I pretty much always track in my books is the main characters and kind of their character development. So for example, in Piranesi, you'll see I have a tab for Piranesi himself. There's also one other character in the book, in the labyrinth with him, called The Other. I created a tab for that person as well. And then eventually a more tertiary character pops up towards the end named 16, and I ended up adding a tab for that person as well, just to mostly track kind of character development in general, things that happen to them or specific moments or events in the story or in kind of like a narrative backstory that might later inform their decisions, things like that. It's pretty general and kind of varies widely depending on the genre that I'm reading. And lastly, for kind of broad spectrum annotating, I also tend to have a tab for kind of quotes or beautiful prose or like interesting structure in general. Structure is one that I tabbed in Piranesi as well. And that is, you know, kind of self-explanatory, just things that I read that I find beautiful. There are also genre specific things that I tend to track, like across genre. For example, a lot of fantasy and dystopian books tend to deal with like oppressive regimes or restriction of resources or access, like from the poor, magic systems, etc. There are so many. Many classics explore like societal roles and like oppressive roles of either like women or people of color. There's often a lot of racial disparity, trauma, etc., and so on. So I will often kind of track those repetitive themes throughout books of that genre. I've even gone as far as to create a tab specifically for things I found relatable. Again, in Department of Speculation by Jenny Offill, I found myself relating to so much of what the character was saying and feeling and thinking that I created just a tab for that so that I could refer back to those specific moments and be like, wow, that is so me. So it can get very specific to you and what you want to get most out of the process of reading that book. Like it can literally be whatever you want. Don't feel pressured to make it anything that anybody else is doing. I'm just sharing kind of what works for me, but you can do whatever works for you. And there are tons of videos out there that can explain more of like a general process. Again, this is just kind of what I do. So I wanted to give you that framework so that when we kind of jump into the flip through, you can see how I in particular approach annotating and like what I decide to be important to me. And you can decide if you might want to apply any or all of that process to your own reading. So after all that chit chat, let's just dive into the flip through. So full of symbolism and mystery and atmosphere that I just knew from even before I picked up the book, I knew that I was going to want to annotate it. Usually on the very first like title page is where I will put my tabs of my different colors. And I'm adding these kind of as I'm going along through the reading process. So you can see up here, this darkest tab is for thematic content. This is a book, again, where I just chose to kind of lump the different themes that were being explored under one category, one color. I also added a tab for structure and like format, prose that I found really interesting. And like I mentioned, I have 3 character tabs. I have one here in this purple color for Piranesi. I have this light purple for the other. And then I added one towards the end with this light blue color for 16, who is another character that gets introduced later. And then I have 2 other tabs here. I have this pink one for the house, and this one is encompassing of like weird things about the house, but also a more kind of religious connection to the house that Piranesi has. And then lastly, this one is specific just to this book actually, but this kind of darker pink color is just question marks. It says come back to this, because since this book is kind of mysterious in a way, I literally added a tab to things I wanted to come back and reference after I had finished the book when I knew what happened. So that's what that tab was for. And right here at the beginning, there is a quote from C.S. Lewis that says, "I am the great scholar, the magician, the adept who is doing the experiment. Of course, I need subjects to do it on." And so I tabbed this with my thematic content color and kind of identified that there could be an exploration of perhaps class warfare or disparity between classes, in the sense that he is kind of holding himself on a pedestal and needing a lower subject to actually be experimented on. So that was before we even got into the book. I actually often tend to annotate quotes at the beginning of books because I feel like they are very, very kind of informative of what's going to be discussed in the book, similar to like an overture in a musical. It really sets the tone. On this very first page, I tabbed for interesting structure, and I highlighted every single like non-proper noun that was capitalized because I thought that was a really interesting use of the language and kind of setting, again, the tone and kind of questioning to myself, like, why exactly is he capitalizing them that way? And on the second page, I added my first tab for the house. This first section explains how Piranesi is caught in a flood and he is able to escape by jumping up onto a statue that kind of saves him. And because he was saved by the statue, he says, "The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite." And I said, that's quite ironic because this house also generated a flood that was going to kill him, but he chose to see it as a positive. So I thought that was interesting and wanted to kind of tab that as my first indication of his connection to the house and his viewpoint of the house as sort of this like holy being. And then here's where I added my first purple tab for Piranesi's color, and that was simply just because you can see I underlined here. He describes himself as a scientist and an explorer. He says, "I have a duty to bear witness to the splendors of the world." So I tabbed that, and then over here I added a tab for the house because, again, it kind of furthers this sort of religious theme where he says the beautiful orderliness of the house is what gives us life. And this is the first introduction. You can see I underlined here to the other, so I continued to kind of track that and then added a tab on the next page, this light purple, for the other. And you can see I kind of had more to write on this page. I highlighted this section talking about the other, and again, kind of referring back to that quote at the beginning, he says that there's this great and secret knowledge somewhere, and by obtaining it, he could potentially dominate lesser intellects and bend them to our will. So again, I tabbed that as thematic content because it's kind of hinting at more potential class disparity. And then further down here, I added another tab for Piranesi. He kind of describes the other and then himself, and there's kind of a big difference in the amount of description he does for the other versus himself. So I thought it was interesting that he barely described himself versus the other. He had a lot to say about him, which indicated to me, again, kind of that theme where he puts himself on a lower pedestal from the other. And on this page, I tabbed more about Piranesi. Again, relating back to him being a scientist and explorer, he finds many sets of like skeletons and bones in this house. And so I thought it was interesting his reaction to them and how he kind of like takes care of them or like processes the bones. I again thought it was kind of more kind of religious based versus science based. So I thought that was interesting. On this page again, I just tabbed another quote about the house, and this I thought was really cool. This is another tab for structure. He is cataloging all of the people that he believes either live or have lived in this house, and he's numbering them, and he says the 16th person, and you, who are you? Who is it that I'm writing for? Or are you perhaps someone who inhabits my own halls long after I'm dead? And I just wrote that this is so interesting. And then over here is our first kind of clue that something is not quite right. He talks about how there are gaps in some of his journals where pages have been violently removed, and so I tabbed that with my first tab for kind of question marking that I wanted to come back to this after I potentially found out what had gone on here so that I could reflect. And again, on this page, I added another one, and this was another moment about the journals and kind of the timeline that was happening there. And here, I didn't add a tab to this section. I sometimes will just underline things, but not necessarily tab them if I don't feel like I really need to recall them. But I was just underlining that this is where the statue is described to us of the cover. So underlined that and wrote the book cover. More structural things happening here that I tabbed. I had guessed that at this point every noun was capitalized except for human person, but that theory ended up not being true. So that tab can kind of be disregarded, and that's okay. I mean, I kept it in there, but don't be afraid to make mistakes. You know, it's just a book at the end of the day. And then again, more kind of thematic content. Now we're in part 2. So at the beginning of part 2, another tab for the other. I thought it was funny that Piranesi said that the other is so intent on what he is doing that he forgets to say hello or goodbye or to ask me how I am. I do not mind. I admire his dedication to his scientific work. I just thought that that was really funny because the other is, like, in my opinion, like, not the nicest, and he sees it as admirable because he is dedicated to this scientific work that they're doing. And they have this moment where they discuss kind of a line of questioning that the other has for him. And again, I didn't tab this, but just something that I wanted to take note of, that something is not quite right about his reaction to what Piranesi is saying. So in this page, again, I didn't tab, but I did highlight. More highlighting here for Piranesi. And on this page, he has an interaction with an albatross, and it is very symbolic, so I tabbed that with thematic content. And there are several stretches of pages where I don't have any tabs or annotations, and that's totally normal. It just kind of depends on the content of the page. And then back here, a seemingly kind of coded message that he receives that I wanted to be able to refer back to. And then here, again, no tab, but I underlined it. And I, at this moment, kind of picked up on a theory that I had, but didn't feel the need to kind of put a tab to it for any reason. And then here, another tab for Piranesi. Here I added a tab for the other. It says he was so neat, so elegant in his suit, his shining shoes. I, on the other hand, was not neat. My clothes were ragged and faded, rotten with the seawater I fished in. Again, drawing these kind of differences between the two of them and lowering himself compared to the other. And then here I added a tab for the house. Here another tab for the house, being an excellent friend. Another tab for something I wanted to refer back to. Okay, this page has quite a bit. So I did a lot of highlighting here, and this section kind of introduces a major theme that I called out, where he talks about the insignificance of knowledge. And so I did a lot of highlighting and writing here, kind of discussing that. And again, kind of talking about class disparity and wanting to control others of lesser minds. So that's why I added that tab for thematic content for both of those moments. And then I added a tab down here for Piranesi, his reaction to learning that the way in which he views the house is much different from the other. And so he's kind of discussing that here, and I'm reacting to that. And the books with the missing pages are kind of seemingly brought up again here. So I added my same kind of pinkish tab. And again, no tab here, but just some highlighting and writing. Like, I thought this was interesting, and he's talking about constellations, and he says this star here, it forms part of the good mother. And later he says the brightest star to symbolize the greatest knowledge. And I said, of course, it's a mother that has the knowledge. I thought that was really funny. Again, another tab for thematic content. Another tab here for the house, and this is kind of where we start to learn that the house might actually be playing tricks on Piranesi, in that it is or has made him forget his memory. So things are starting to pick up a little bit at this point, and I started getting really annoyed at the other at this point. So that's what this tab is for. I was not happy about the things that he was saying to Piranesi. It's so clear that he was lying to him, trying to make his memory unreliable. And here I added another tab for structure. This might be the last one. I did not have a lot of these, but he mentions the 16th person. If only the 16th person were here, like, to kind of help him with his memory. And I was like, I am, and I'm telling you, he is lying. And here, again, something that I wanted to refer back to. Just seems a little fishy and not quite right. So I wanted to refer back to that at a later point. And this is the first tab that I added for another character that I wanted to track. There's one other character we've been introduced to at this point, but I wasn't tracking that person. But this person I did want to track. This is 16. So it turns out that the reader is actually not the 16th person. There is a 16th person. I wanted to start tracking this person and kind of what is said about them to see if that ended up tracking true when we actually come to meet them or not. And again, more talk about 16. I marked it as the other though because of what he said about that person. And again, just writing some things that I'm kind of learning or surmising as I'm going, nothing super important. Another highlight about the house, and then another highlight where he experiences hearing a voice who is talking in like normal speak, as if he was like a worldly person. And it was a very confusing experience for Piranesi to hear that for the moment that he did. So I wanted to refer back to that. And another thing, I wanted to refer back to this letter that he finds written from Lawrence, because so far we don't know much about this Lawrence character, and he ends up becoming a much bigger part of the book later on. And now we're at part 3. So this page, you can see obviously I had a lot to say. This is the section of the book where we are introduced to a new character who is titled The Prophet. And he has this sort of long talk with Piranesi where he dumps a lot of information on Piranesi, who has no sort of context or understanding for what he's talking about, explaining why this labyrinth exists and kind of how he may have ended up getting here, but it's very vague. He's having it very conversationally as if Piranesi knows what he's talking about. So I said, wow, so much information is being revealed, it's making my head hurt. Maybe we're supposed to feel this way, like Piranesi learning all of this. In this moment, I felt very deeply in the shoes of Piranesi, being just as confused about the information that's being revealed as he was, and I felt like that was very purposeful. And then I also put a tab for the other because the prophet ends up telling us a lot about him, and just some more stuff that I'm kind of theorizing that may potentially be happening based on the clues that I have. This didn't really end up being true, but that's okay. Some more kind of general underlining, and then tabbing for the house again. This page has tabs of all different colors on it, some thematic content, more tabs for the house, more tabs for things I wanted to refer back to, and a tab for 16, because again, a lot of this is in anticipation, 16 coming. A lot happening on this page as well. Again, we're learning a lot more information about the people who may have potentially inhabited this house before, and we learned that the other could potentially be very dangerous, so I added that tab for the other. And then we actually get a little bit of insight into who Piranesi was before he was imprisoned here and lost his memory, so I tabbed that. And then I added this tab for thematic content. Oh, and then I actually did add one more tab for structure here. And I added that kind of in this section, but speaking more just about part 3 in general, about how all of this information is being revealed to us about Piranesi. It's very much in like weird bits and pieces, and the timeline kind of feels all over the place. And so I said, I'm obsessed with how this viewpoint is laid out. It's like watching Memento, which if you guys have ever seen Memento, it's told in chunks, like backwards. It's a very just disjointed way of storytelling, and that's kind of what I felt like the structure was laying out for us. So I tabbed that. And then again, more talk of 16 here. And I added another tab for Piranesi because there's really a lot of kind of going back and forth of his viewpoint of the other. Can he trust him? Can he not? Based on the information he knows, should he be complacent? There's just a lot of back and forth. And in this section, Piranesi removes a lot of like the shells and kelp and things that he has found in the house in the water and kind of sewn into his hair. And he says, I feel oddly naked without them. And I thought that was interesting. I said his separation from the house is almost like a religious person being without a cross, or like a physical manifestation of their sort of faith. In this section, we do a deep dive into Piranesi's journals, and here he's kind of just reflecting on who he was when he was writing these journal entries that he has no memory of, that he seemed younger, and some more thematic content here. He, again, is confronted with some manipulation of his, like, journaling system, and he says, I sat for a while trying to comprehend this, but I could make nothing of it. And I just said that this concept of lack of knowledge or interest in gaining it is so interesting, especially given that we believe, or Piranesi self-identifies as like a scientist and an explorer. So why does he not want to get to the deeper root of why these journal entries don't make sense? More things that I want to refer back to, characters and details that are getting revealed. Another tab for the house and some kind of highlighting and writing about that. another tab for the house being comforting, and another tab for the theme of complacency, where he's very much kind of in this state of mental disarray. He really doesn't know who to trust, what is real, what is not real, and instead of trying to contemplate it all, he just passes the time by doing ordinary, soothing activities, again, kind of cropping up that theme of complacency. More connection to the house. Another tab for Piranesi. And I could have also added a tab for thematic content again. He tells himself that the house is enlarging his understanding of this thing, and I just thought it was interesting. I said he can never ascribe this gaining of knowledge or understanding to himself as a smart person. There's always an external force at play, like giving him this knowledge. So again, that theme of complacency. And now we're on to part 4. And I added a tab for Piranesi because this is where we really get a shift in his feelings towards the other. And added a tab for 16 because he is convinced that 16 was here. Another tab for Piranesi, so again, just some more development of his character and how conflicted he is. Another tab for 16, seems like a note that we get from that person. And then another tab for thematic content. This didn't really come up much more, but I just wrote a theme of propaganda, or like one big metaphor, in that a lot of what the other is doing is kind of manipulating the words and expectations of this 16th person. And this is where we learn the name of the 16th person. So I added a tab for that. And I didn't add a tab here, but I probably should have, for 16, where I guess, and happen to guess correctly, that 16 might be a woman. And here again, something that I wanted to refer back to, a potential message that was left for Piranesi from 16. I'm really still trying to figure out how these 3 people are kind of connecting together. Another tab for 16. I was trying to postulate what kind of connection that 16 could have, and I ended up being wrong about that, but no worries there. And then I added a tab for Piranesi from one of his earlier journals where he says something about disappearing, and I thought that was funny because that's exactly what happened to him. And this is quite a long section where I didn't have any, again, annotations or tabs. That's very normal. And then here, I added a tab for Piranesi again because we are introduced to what we potentially think could be his real name. And another tab for the house. He calls himself a beloved child of the house. And here, another tab for the other. Now, through this perspective, we're able to understand what that means and the impact of that. And at the end of part 4, I very appropriately wrote, I feel like shit's about to hit the fan. And that's pretty much exactly what happens. So we are now in part 5. And I'm doing some highlighting here because this is where we jump back in time to before Piranesi was trapped in the maze. And these are kind of the events leading up to what happens. So it's very different from what we have previously been reading. And I added another tab for thematic content of just kind of our perception of what's happening versus Piranesi's. The others asking, so you've told lots of people that you were coming here today to see me, all your friends. And I said, okay, freak, because like that's a weird thing to just ask somebody you don't know. And then he later starts talking about performing a ritual, and I'm like, yeah, no, thank you. And here at the end of the section, I added another tab for the other because he is an absolute freak, as you can see what I've written. And I'm, again, starting to kind of postulate that who potentially this 16 person could be. I ended up being wrong on both accounts here, but that's okay. Part 6. And here I added another tab for Piranesi and how finally at this point is truly the turning point for him in terms of his view of the other. And again, no tab here, but just something I thought was kind of interesting and weird. These pages are a little bit more plot heavy, so nothing too like symbolic that I was feeling the need to tab. And then here, I correctly postulated that 16 sounded kind of like a cop in the way that she came running in and talking, so that ended up being correct. And sadly here, this is where the other ends up getting caught in the flood, so I added that tab there. Again, also kind of just thinking about how everything happened, what Piranesi's reaction in the following pages ends up becoming. And I was correct in my guess that 16 was a police officer, so I added that tab there. And I added another tab for Piranesi here because he is given the opportunity to leave this labyrinth and go home, but he says that he is home because he has such a deep spiritual connection to this place and all of his memories are here. He doesn't want to leave. So we get a real shift in kind of his character development in this last section. And I added another tab for Piranesi because now he has to reckon with his identity as Piranesi versus Matthew. And again, he still continues to call himself a beloved child of the house. So I added the house tab. And again, this sort of reckoning and reaction to the other's death is really interesting to me. And so I added that tab here as Piranesi kind of reflects on his death and says that he is dead, my only friend and my only enemy. I just thought that was kind of sad. And he still goes through this kind of, again, religious procession of what he does with the bones in the same way. And he says, I'm sorry that I was angry with you, forgive me. So it's quite sad. No tab here, but just some underlining that I felt like was relatable to our world in general. And something interesting here that I highlighted but didn't put a tab to, but I should now that I have kind of done a little bit more research on this book about thematic content. There was a really interesting point someone made on Reddit about how the different types of like dispositions of people within the house kind of dictate what happens to them. The people who lean towards being more evil end up, dying or something bad happens to them, whereas people like Piranesi and 16 who are of, good-natured hearts see it as sort of this holy place. More thematic content. Now we're kind of getting into something a little bit more deeply emotional towards the end of the book and more about how we choose to see the world and our perception of things, how we can choose to see the good in the world if we want, or we can choose to see sadness. And that is really kind of a huge point between 16 and Piranesi. Even more kind of about that here, so I added another tab. More kind of religious symbolism here. I should have added a tab for the house here. Some more underlining just of things to kind of come back to. And this is a point that I kind of briefly touched on in the Powell's reading vlog, but I wasn't talking about spoilers, so I wanted to bring it up here. I thought this last section of part 7 where he is reacclimated into the world was so interesting because it reminded me a lot of the book Room, and honestly kind of a lot of Piranesi in general, but the child in that book has a very different perception of what it's like to be inside that room versus being out of it. And here we assume that Piranesi's kind of like escape and reintegration into the world is supposed to be a good thing. It's supposed to be, a happy ending. He doesn't necessarily see it that way, and he's often confused by the way in which people act in the real world because he has no memory of it and of our like customs and our kind of like social norms. He finds it hard to kind of acclimate in that way, and I thought that was a really, really kind of strong correlation between those two books, so I noted that there. And again, here's some more connection to the house as sort of a religious like temple sort. In this section here, I added a tab for the other because that's kind of who we're talking about, but there also could be a tab here for thematic content and talking about the symbolism of the statue and how it relates to the other and what I feel is the world kind of more broadly in general. Another tab for 16 and her kind of small character development that we get towards the end of this novel. And here we are on the very last page. I did quite a bit of underlining, and I of course highlighted the very last line, which says the beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. And I added a tab for the house. And again, this kind of symbolism that he sees throughout the real world that reminds him of the house, the labyrinth that he came from. I could also add a tab here for thematic content because again, it just drives home what we sort of get into in the latter half of this book, which is that beauty is everywhere, you just have to look for it. And I wrote that I love the theme of our perspective kind of determining how happy or content we are in life. And I wrote what a delightful book because I did really enjoy it. And that's it. That is everything. So that is my annotated copy of Piranesi. So that is it. That was my entire page-by-page flip through of Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I really hope that you guys enjoyed getting to kind of see my annotation process. This is the first time I've shared anything like this, but I, again, just loved this book so much and felt like I got so much out of it that I really wanted to share it with you guys and to maybe inspire you to maybe try annotating if you haven't already. It is not as scary as it may seem, and if anything, it's never perfect. I mean, like you guys saw in the flip through, there were a lot of pages where I could have even added more tabs for things, and I have not tried this yet, but I also have wanted to kind of reread a book that I've already annotated and go through again with maybe a different color pen and to see just kind of like what more I can gain even from a second read. And I definitely feel like this is a book where I could gain more from it reading it again a second time. So the work is never finished, it's never perfect, but it is a process for you to kind of enjoy and just, have fun being a part of. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. There are definitely other books that I have that are very thoroughly annotated that I also love. So let me know if you guys would be interested in seeing other page-by-page flip throughs. If I did one in the future, it wouldn't obviously be as information heavy as the beginning of this one was, just because I wanted to kind of take you guys through my process. I could also do a more of a deep dive into the like nitty-gritty of my annotating process, maybe taking you through parts of a book as I'm actually in the process of annotating it. So let me know if any of that sounds of interest to you guys or if that's something that you would want to see, because because this is a topic that I do love to talk about because I do it all the time. So yeah, that is it for this one. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a like and consider subscribing for more annotation or bookish content. And yeah, that's it. See you later. Bye.